Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be chatting about the WHO's new pandemic treaty and its implications for Canada, Mark Carney's decision to end MP question period in the Liberal vote against party reform, Canada's underreported rise in terrorism charges, the approval of over 834,000 temporary residents in 3 months, and concerns raised by a parent about hormone replacement therapy discussions involving 9-year-old children in Essex County schools. All right, let's get started. So first off, we've got the WHO pandemic treaty was adopted. What does this mean for Canada? Canada has signed the World Health Organization's newly legally binding pandemic agreement, committing the country to sweeping changes in pandemic preparedness, including global surveillance, vaccine sharing, and regulatory coordination. The treaty mandates that Canada surrenders up to 20% of its vaccines and treatments to the WHO during future pandemics, while discouraging domestic stockpiling beyond necessity. Though the agreement doesn't explicitly authorize the WHO to impose lockdowns or vaccine mandates, critics say its vague language on regulatory measures and misinformation opens the door to unelected global influence. Conservative MP Leslyn Lewis and others argue the deal compromises Canadian sovereignty, especially since Parliament never fully debated or approved it. The US, meanwhile, has rejected the treaty and initiated withdrawal from the WHO, citing accountability failures. So, what are the potential consequences of letting unelected global bodies influence domestic health policy?
Well, first and foremost, the erosion of national sovereignty, right? This seems to be sort of the liberal agenda. I don't know how long it's been part of the liberal agenda, definitely since Trudeau, this whole post-national situation. These are the things that push us closer towards that. You have a lack of democratic accountability when unelected officials at a global stage can make decisions and, whatever happens. How do you hold these people accountable? The answer is you can't. And the thing is, you don't even have any power as the electorate to change it. You just go, oh, I guess we're fucked then. Wonderful. In my opinion, this all sort of leads to diminished public trust. If our government's willing to give power to these other groups, giving us zero power, and then anything goes wrong. So first of all, people will go, oh, it's not a big deal. The WHO is going to save us. But as soon as anything goes wrong, zero public trust. There's not going to be any left, right? And as far as the tools they plan to employ, the WHO is going to cause a lot of trouble with this the moment that they press this button, for sure. Because we will have suppression of dissent. There's a number of things in there about disinformation and misinformation and a unified story. So, you and I have talked about this before. We looked at what happened through COVID, and instead of governments going, "Hey, sorry, we overreacted," they went, "Here's what we got wrong. We're going to improve that next time." And we know one of those is suppressing the opposing view. We know that's significant, so that's going to happen. The behavioral manipulation part scares the shit out of me. That they're going to start using psychological tactics to steer public behavior. That was pretty dark. So one of the things that I noticed in there was the techniques they were going to use. And one of them is called a nudging technique. So basically what they're going to try to do out of the gates is they're going to try to use social pressure. Basically, you're an outcast if you don't comply. If that doesn't work, they want to use fear. So that's the global government that our government's not giving power to. They just want to use fear against you if they can't make you a social pariah for not following their set of rules. That's insane to me. Then there's this psychological profiling they're doing so that they can try to win you over with propaganda. What the hell? And finally, surveillance. They're just going to watch you to make sure you're complying. I'm going, guys, what is happening right now? And we know there's going to be resource misallocation here. Like you said about, they're going to be diverting vaccines and stuff. And honestly, I'm not a big fan of them. I think that there's much to be desired in the world of vaccines, in my opinion. But telling us that we have to ship 20% of our therapies and vaccines off to other countries could create a problem for Canadians. The reason I say that, even for people that maybe are on the same page as me about vaccines, is there were therapies here. Bamlanivimab was one, for example. I did a video on that originally out of COVID. I got so much heat for it, but it was right. It was approved by the Health Canada, but then it was stopped at the provincial levels. This thing had 100% success rate as a treatment for COVID-19. 100%. Data's all there. You can look it up. So if these things come to light through another pandemic or whatever it may be, well, now 20% of those have to be offshored to other countries. So that can be a pretty significant problem. But perhaps the most egregious issue we have here is they have the opportunity for crisis expansion. So climate change, air pollution, whatever else they deem an issue. Basically, you are giving this global body more power to decide what the crisis is and what we should do. And people go, Well, they don't have the legal leverage to force a vaccine or to force a lockdown. But they didn't last time either. And look what happened. So now they may have these tools of, well, now we've got a climate problem. This is what we recommend. Now Canada goes, yeah, no problem. Canada championed this shit. We're a bunch of idiots. We're like, our government is the one who really championed this whole idea. It was them, I think, in some northern European country that championed this whole thing. So we're in trouble here, in my opinion. And perhaps the biggest, maybe most egregious problem we have here is their opportunity for crisis expansion to things like climate change and pollution. So, you can argue that the WHO was not given the power to enforce mandates or lockdowns, but the thing is they didn't have the power last time, and look what happened. So my concern is now this global overreach and the government overreach on any of these issues are just going to continue to get worse and worse. And as we know, a one-size-fits-all solution doesn't work. So top-down leadership, the further you are away from a crisis, the less effective it's going to be. So overall, huge problem.
Well, even when it comes to the legal authority argument, well, it's not, the WHO doesn't have the ability to enforce lockdowns or vaccine mandates. But let's just say it's you and I in a scenario, and I have, let's say I'm Canada, you're the WHO. If I have the legal authority to impose certain mandates and stuff, but I say that I'm just going to do whatever he says, it doesn't really matter where the legal authority lies, whether you have it and then you're enforcing me, or whether I sit here and I say I'm going to do whatever he says.
When you're both on the same team.
It doesn't make a difference one way or another there. I always think, too, one that flew under the radar that was very telling is when Trudeau was in Parliament one time during question period, and he said, when the next pandemic occurs, we need to be ready for that. You go, so on this one hand, you're telling us that you had no idea that this pandemic was going to occur. And he was definitely within the context of what he was saying. He was pointing to being over the next decade or two. And so you go, you're telling us that this thing appeared out of nowhere, which we know is a lie. You guys were collaborating on the research that led to it.
You manufactured it.
Yeah.
Nice.
But at the same time, now you're saying we also know that we can predict these things are going to happen again. And so it's wild, actually, even to, I think this is one of the big issues you can point to the Trump administration on, as well as it seems like there's been no massive inroads, at least yet, on shutting down this gain of function stuff.
Right.
It's still just completely going off. But yeah, it's a massive, massive issue on that front. And then when it comes to the kind of the authoritarian playbook, you see this because we've heard this line all throughout, even since COVID ended, was we need to learn from the last pandemic, which every single time, all that means is that we need to do what we did quicker and harder. And it's
we didn't make any mistakes. We just didn't do enough of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Come on.
And so that's exactly what you see with this mindset here on all of this. And actually, it's funny too, even. And then one thing I can't wrap my head around as well is, all right, there's these ideologies that wreaked absolute havoc throughout the 20th century, one of them being Nazism, the other being communism and Marxism. And just, if let's say there was somebody that was a part of a Nazi party or any other fascist party within Europe, whether he was part of Franco's regime or in Spain, whatever, any of these things, if somebody had been a part of that apparatus and then was running the WHO, nobody in the world would be cool with that. Would be like, why the hell is there a Nazi or a fascist in the top seat of that? But then you look at Tedros, the head of the WHO, and you go look back to his past in Ethiopia when he was working as the health minister in Ethiopia. He was working with the Marxist and communist regimes there. And so it's wild to me that these Marxists, and you see it even in their policies, right? These surrendering up to 20% of its vaccines for redistribution. And you go they view everything as needing to be centrally planned and redistributed through bureaucracy in order to achieve equality. And these are very Marxist principles. And so you see them being put in action and just nobody pays attention to it. And no flags raised. The
only thing that I think, when you look at what's happening in the West, that seems to be the overarching ideology. Mm-hmm. They're winning right now. Mm-hmm. And because they're winning, I think that, the people in power are letting those people stay in power. But one thing that is positive is the United States is not involved. The United States is not only are we not getting involved in this, we're leaving the entire organization. You guys are idiots. So that's at least a positive in my opinion. So, maybe move south.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Carney cancels questions and disarms MPs. Welcome to Canada's new technocracy. Mark Carney has barely entered office and already his leadership signals a troubling shift. Even less accountability and more centralized control. First, he's scrapping the tradition of attending weekly question periods, a transparency gesture upheld even by Justin Trudeau. Then the Liberal caucus under Carney voted against adopting the Reform Act, legislation that would empower MPs to hold their leader accountable, including the ability to remove a sitting prime minister. This double move reveals a deep distrust of democratic mechanisms. While Carney's defenders argue he revived the party, accountability isn't just for hard times, it's a democratic constant. Instead, Carney seems to be ushering in a top-down technocratic style of governance where oversight is optional and power flows inward. For Canadians, the message is clear. Expect a government that looks polished on the surface but increasingly insulated from scrutiny underneath. Carney's brand of leadership isn't democratic renewal, it's consolidation dressed in the language of stability. So, should Canadians be concerned about a shift toward technocratic governance under Carney?
Yes, Canadians should be very concerned about a shift towards technocratic governance. This is not a good look for Canada. It's interesting because it's kind of the bird in the hand situation with Trudeau. He's not that bright, and he was making a lot of mistakes in public, and we were able to scrutinize him for that, which I think was to our benefit. In some sense, if you're going to make these, if you're going to do these egregious things, at least we can see them and we can try to call you out for them and try to make change. Carney's basically building a wall that no one can see behind, and he's going to continue doing things, and he's going to be more efficient and more effective. This is pretty dangerous. I mean, under this strategy, power is going to shift from elected representatives to unelected experts and bureaucrats, basically sidelining public opinion. Now, I think this has already been the case. But again, when you get a guy like Trudeau, it's like he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. So we always kind of knew the playbook. Now I'm concerned we have no idea. Obviously, this will erode democracy and centralized power, which, of course, like you said, leads to less accountability, as if it could get any worse in this country. So, I mean, so far they're 0 for 2. The thing that happens, though, for me, once you start taking all these things away, once you sort of take away public opinion, once you start taking away transparency, once you start sort of eroding democracy in a sense, you have voter disempowerment. And when that happens, and we don't feel like we can influence policy, eventually we're going to get pissed off. The crowd's going to get upset. We're going to go, hey, we need to change something. So what does the government do? What's the government's only option at that point? They have to silence and punish dissent. So for me, this is a very, very dangerous precedent.
Here's a question then. Do you think, because I don't really know the answer here, but do you think that the population of Canada, if we imagine that, say, a common way of ranking certain leaders in countries is disapproval meters and stuff, right? So they bring in Carney, even though we've covered in the past that all his main cabinet ministers and such are just Liberal Party insiders. They're all Trudeau loyalists. It's just more of the same with a new face, right? Do you think, because, okay, Trudeau was extremely unpopular at his end. I'm not even saying this was a legitimate number, but let's imagine that his, and I assume it's roughly in this area, that his approval rating was like 20%.
Yeah.
80% of people disapprove.
Is around there, yeah.
Yeah. And so let's imagine that now, I don't think they've even done polls on this with Carney yet, so we don't really have numbers. But okay, that meter gets balanced. It's back to 50 and 50% now.
Yeah.
Do you think that it takes a long period of corruption and more incompetence, all of this kind of stuff, to get it back down to 20%? Or do you think it'll snap like that and people will go, oh, it's just more of the exact same?
So I think that's an interesting question. If I had to put a timeline on it, I would say there's a few contributing factors. One is how bad is the economy? Mm-hmm. Because if the average Canadian still can't put food on the table, if inflation's high, if they still can't afford homes, that's going to shift it, regardless of what's happening behind closed doors. That's going to shift it back down pretty quickly. So I think the worse the economy is and the worse lives are for everyday Canadians, that will shift down quicker. Higher immigration is, and the more you feel that in terms of stressed infrastructure, same thing. I think it'll drive that number back down. Now, those are things that you feel every day that is not necessarily about the decision you made and the opinion you have about the person you voted for. So if those things happen, I think it can snap back within a year, 12 months, I think is reasonable. Now, if those things started to slowly improve, now just still way off the rails, totally fucked, but started to slowly improve, I think it would take a couple of years, because even though Carney might be doing a lot of corrupt things, nefarious things, and lacking transparency and increasing censorship and doing all these things, those don't affect the everyday Canadians that voted for him. And I think that they will still have some cognitive dissonance around the whole thing because they voted for him. So if he's able to improve the significant markers in society, even marginally, he'll hang on for a couple of years without plummeting his approval rating. If not, though, and he's maintaining this track of no transparency, more censorship, and all this other bullshit, I think 12 months.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to play out, because I think it's just going to continue downhill. I don't think he's going to be able to manage it at all. Even we just saw with his the main estimates reveal from the own government says that federal spending is set to rise by 7.75%. And we just covered this in the last episode, that government spending, now that's just a federal increase. However, you can imagine it's going to be the same on both provincial and municipal levels as well. But government spending is already 44.7% of our GDP, which is wild. That's straight up socialism.
Yes.
When I say that and people go, "Oh, you're being hyperbolic. Canada is not a socialist country." I go, "What number of public spending does it need to hit for you to say that this is socialism?"
Yes.
A government-run economy. We're at 44.7%.
I don't think people understand metrics well enough. I don't think people have the KPIs to look for.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like you say that to someone, they go, "Well, I don't know what the baseline is. Maybe America's 50%, Liam."
Yeah.
So I think that's the problem, because that is a stark number.
So you see, okay, the number one reason that things get more expensive or that cost of living goes up is because of unchecked government spending, because it always, two things happen. Either that spending increases and it's done through taxes, so you get to keep less of the money you make, or that government spending is funded through money printing and increasing the money supply, and therefore your dollar is worth less. But either way, you end up getting a worse off cost of living. And so we're already seeing that when it comes to housing, all of this. I think those prices are just going to completely remain unsustainable for the average Canadian. My big thing is just, do people start that and go, "Oh, he's walking in from Trudeau's mess, and therefore, we need to cut him some slack"? Is that going to be their mindset?
That's going to be the cognitive dissonance thing. That'll be part of it, because they want to believe that they were not fooled.
Right.
I wasn't fooled. You might have been fooled. So, question for you. Classic liberal. What do you think the ideal government spending is for classic liberalism? Classic.
So we're talking pretty much libertarianism.
Correct. Sorry.
I'd say 20%.
15 to 25.
Yeah.
So bang on in the middle. Nice one. Okay. Centrist. So social market view, but centrist.
25 to 30.
25 to 35. Social and democratic.
100%.
Progressive view spending, 35 to 50%. So we're getting on the far end of this right now. So I want people to have that frame of reference now to go, oh, when we hit 50% of GDP for government spending, we're full-blown socialists, basically teetering on the edge of communism, just so we're clear.
Well, and this is the thing with, at least with the difference too between the States and Canada to keep in mind with this, because I do agree that the States' public spending is getting completely out of control. And it has been for the last few decades.
However, their largest spending is on military too.
But there's also that added aspect of the U.S. economy is the strongest in the world.
Yes.
And it is increasing. Now, it's not the quickest growing economy in it's about middle of the pack.
Yeah.
But it's still increasing, especially even the per capita GDP and all of this kind of stuff.
Right.
So it's like, okay, you're taking
that's a very good designation to make.
I'm not excusing the amount of waste in public spending, but I'm saying that weight on the back of the person, the average taxpayer, is stronger in America.
They can make up ground, and they can, not that they can afford, their debt is significant, but at least they have the economic engine in place to see a road to recovery,
right,
or correcting course. We do not.
That's a point that a buddy of mine was making, is he goes, I don't think at this point that you can't really actually even decrease the budget through spending cuts alone.
No.
The goal to get rid of, especially in America's case, I mean, it should be the same for Canada, but we're not doing anything to take these steps, is to outgrow the deficit.
You need to. Yeah. I think it's a two-pronged approach in that sense.
I think it's two-pronged as well, because otherwise, once you just start making, let's say your economy grows, and if you keep the same spending habits even by percentage, then you're just taking on more and more debt.
So anyway.
You have to do both. And that's actually even something in regards to Carney and his fiscal approach as well, is this aspect of, okay, he's cutting middle class taxes. I think it's about $5 to $6 billion worth of revenue that they're cutting from this 1% income tax decrease for the middle class, which, hey, I'm all for tax cuts, but you also have to pair that with spending cuts.
Yes.
Because otherwise you're just taking on more debt.
Yes.
And so all you're doing is saying, hey, don't worry, we're saving taxpayers. We're saving you $5 to $6 billion now. But that $5 to $6 billion you're saving is actually just going to be compounded with interest.
Yeah, it's a loan with compounded interest. Yes.
So you're saving $5 billion now, but you're going to owe 10 to 15 in a decade.
I just keep the 5. Yeah, it's such a mess. Yeah.
And then the last part about that as well, with the Liberal Party voting against the Reform Act. So, because this is even the same bullshit. This is the same thing. The Conservatives have this in Canada.
I think so did the NDP.
That's how they ousted Aaron O'Toole.
Yes.
Is that the caucus voted against it, but the Liberal Party doesn't even want this mechanism. And it's so crazy to me to actually, see this cognitive dissonance of guys like Andrew Coyne, who is a CBC commentator in Canada. And
in fairness, I'm not sure that's as much cognitive dissonance as it is like, don't bite the hand that feeds you. I got to get paid.
No, his point was that he tweeted out about this whole Mark Carney Reform Act and all of this kind of stuff, and said how, like the Liberals were never going to do this because any MP that spoke up and wanted the power to be able to remove the prime minister would just become a target of the prime minister. And you go, that's definitely how politics works.
That's a good point.
But he was saying that, I hope these Liberal MPs enjoy their servitude. It's like, you just spent months campaigning for this party, and now you're looking at it being like, it's completely authoritarian, essentially, is what you're saying, that there is no dissent allowed within the party. And you're like, you just spent months going on in favor of this party. Like, what the hell are we
That's
doing
not even
here?
cognitive dissonance. That's him basically saying, I know I lied, but I do have to get paid.
Yeah.
Here's the truth.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I'm not even upset that he's doing it. I'm upset at part A, not part B.
Right.
Is what it is, though.
Hey, everyone. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If so, please consider leaving us a kind review wherever you're listening. If even just a quarter of our weekly audience did so, we'd instantly become one of the top-rated Canadian podcasts. We appreciate you helping us out. And now, back to the show. All right, moving on, we've got Canada's terrorism surge, the quiet crisis no one is talking about. While Canadians were preoccupied with political distractions and economic turmoil, a far more serious threat emerged. A 488% surge in terrorism charges between April 2023 and March 2024. According to a newly released RCMP briefing, 25 individuals, including minors, were charged with 83 terrorism-related offenses, while 8 youth were placed under terrorism peace bonds, underscoring a disturbing rise in youth radicalization. Online platforms are cited as the primary driver, grooming adolescents into violent extremism. 6 terror plots were foiled in the past year alone, with targets ranging from pride events to pro-Israel demonstrations. Some suspects had international links, including ISIS sympathizers and individuals charged with financing terrorism through Gaza crowdfunding platforms. The RCMP warns its current mandate is unsustainable due to chronic underfunding. Despite the severity, the Liberal government delayed public release of this data until after the 2025 leadership transition to Mark Carney. Canada now faces a national security crisis, one the government appears ill-equipped or unwilling to confront. Is Canada sleepwalking into a preventable disaster due to political negligence and institutional complacency?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, with a massive surge of terrorism charges, you said 488% and half a dozen terror plots foiled. Like, that's in just the last year. That's bananas. Of course, we have a huge problem here. I think the issue you have is that we've become a safe haven and a hotbed for international terrorists, which is policy driven. I think that's an important designation to make. This has happened because of bad policy. That's how these people get in. That's why the threshold is the way it is. And the other side of that, too, is a lot of our organizations are compromised. We know we've had conversations with Luke Sabrin about the CBSA, stuff that we've read from Sam Cooper about China and their infiltration. We know that that Canada is deeply compromised on almost every level. And I think that you're seeing that translate to policy. It's interesting, right? Because if you think about how you penetrate a country in that sense, or infiltrate, penetrate, whatever. So you jump in at first and you compromise an organization, then you start compromising your way up, and then you start compromising politics. Once you compromise politics, well, then you don't have to do it illegally anymore, right? Because then you get them to pass policy, then you can legally enforce your will on that nation, but you can do it at scale. And that's what's happening. And you see, that's not necessarily the terrorism side. That's more like the Chinese, maybe the Russians, maybe India. And they're leveraging it because of economic benefits. And you look at China, you think about organized crime. So the symptom though of that is you're going to see a massive rise in terrorism because of that policy that they let through. So again, this is all policy driven decisions. And obviously now as a result, we have youth radicalization. Not a big surprise. It is unfortunate that the RCMP is underfunded. However, they're also compromised in a big way too. So I don't know that just throwing more money at that organization is the right solution. In fact, I don't think that it is. And obviously, cool, our government's going to delay releasing information. Obviously, they're going to do that because it's political cover-up. They need to cover their own ass. Whoever passed this policy, they did it for the wrong reasons. How do you explain these things? You can't. You can't talk your way out of that. You basically have to stonewall them by just saying, giving a Trudeau-esque response in Parliament, which is just something scripted that has nothing to do with the question. Okay, fine. But the bigger problem is we have no plan in place to counter this other than watching the media claim that it's because of populism or right-wing extremism, right? So this is the issue you have is you kind of look at how that all trickled down into this position, and it's like, but we have no solution in place and we won't do anything about it except for blame people that have nothing to do with the crisis. So I don't know what we do.
Yeah, well, this goes completely in line with what the new FBI director, Kash Patel, was saying last week, right? Where he was talking about how Iran, Russia, and China are funneling people and violent extremists and terrorists and criminals and all this kind of stuff into the States, but through Canada.
Yeah.
I think it was like 2021 or 2022, something like that, where the amount of people on terrorist watch lists that were snagged at the border of Canada, America, was around 350 in a year. So that's pretty crazy. That's one a day, pretty much,
of
on
a terrorist,
on somebody on a terrorist watch list that's trying to get through the.
And like, how do you get it? You got to do some shit to get on a terrorist watch list.
And that's just what's caught too, right? As well.
Yeah, on the largest open border in the fucking world, 9,000 kilometer border. Exactly. That is only like less than 1% of it's actually under control.
And to even you look at, okay, that's just land border crossings. Actually, to your point about Luke Sabrin and what he talked about in regards to the CBSA, is that even internal management, high up management at the CBSA was instructing officers to cover up or at least look the other way when they found human smuggling operations at the border. And so you go, yeah, like I'm of the mind, I don't know how bad it is, but I know it's worse than what we're being told.
Definitely.
And what we're being told is a 488% surge in these kind of instances. And so it's got to be worse than that,
that's a really good point. Yeah. You never get the full story. So when you see the stats, it's kind of safe to double or triple it, which is alarming. Again, I just don't see how we work our way out of this. I think Canada's got itself into a real jackpot here. Sometimes you can fix your mistake. You punch a hole in the wall, you can patch the drywall, right? But the thing is, when you bulldoze half the house, you're not putting it back together. You're taking it all down. We've bulldozed half the house, at least. So it's irreparable. And I just don't think I think what's happening, it's actually an interesting analogy now that I think about it, is I think a lot of Canadians are in the front yard, but they bulldozed the back half. So people aren't seeing what's really going on yet. Yeah. And I think when they finally do, they're going to go, oh my God, it's too late. What does this look like?
Well, one of the things that I think about in regards to all of this is just the styles of warfare. Because I think when people look at differing countries and when war breaks out, they think of it as two armies fighting each other in conventional warfare. But typically what ends up actually happening in wars is that you have a empire, like a large military force fighting a conventional war, and then you have a smaller power that's fighting more guerrilla warfare tactics, kind of more chaotic, single cells, that kind of stuff. Some great examples of this. Actually, the whole Israel and Palestine war is an example of that. You've got a more guerrilla force being Hamas fighting a more conventional force being the IDF. Then you've got, even you look back at the Vietnam War with the Viet Cong against the American military. In Afghanistan, it was the same with America and the Taliban. Even back to the 80s, it was the Taliban versus the Soviets. And that's usually how warfare works, is a guerrilla warfare, more chaotic, hit and move kind of strategy. And then you've got more, you're like, almost think about it like a football team where you're like, okay, we've got a unit and we work it all together kind of idea. I think a lot of what is happening isn't necessarily bringing these people into our nations, whether it be the UK, whether it be America, whether it be Canada, to have these one-off events and terror attacks. Like, I think that might happen, but I don't think that's the primary. That's the primary strategy. I think the primary strategy is to get people into that position so that if a war ever does break out, say between China and America or an Iran and America, it's like, oh, you're going to try to hit us here with your
football team.
With your football team.
Cool.
We've already got people in your backyard.
We've got landmines there ready for you to step on.
Right. As soon as you attack us, we're just going to tell everyone to cause. There's not even going to be a strategy. It's just going to be cause
chaos.
Mayhem. Just cause mayhem.
Blow shit up.
Yeah.
That it doesn't make sense otherwise. I'm sure some of them are just seeking refuge and don't want to be involved in the terror game anymore. But for the most part, you're in. So I think it's kind of a, my opinion, it's very gang-like. You don't get out. You get killed if you try to get out. You know too much. So I think a lot of those people are exactly like you said. They're sleeper cells, which is crazy.
This is also the thing, because, you mentioned, okay, I'm sure some people are just trying to escape, and 100%. But if you think about, say, terrorism or violent people like this is what I was even pointing out to somebody last night about crime, is people, they go, well, it's not everybody. And I go, yeah, but that's not the problem. I agree. It's only, say, 1 to 3% of them.
Yes.
And like, that's typically a good map and model for psychopaths, is just 1 to 3%. But you don't need, look at it like anthrax. You don't need a lot of it to kill a bunch of people.
Yes.
It doesn't need to be a massive amount.
No.
And so it's the same thing with crime. Like, you don't need hundreds of thousands of people to completely go off the wall to cause a lot of destruction. Like, even if you think about it, okay, let's say you've got 10,000 terrorist cells have been imported into America or Canada, whatever nation you want to call, over the last 10 years.
Yes.
Because we've been taking in, you even look in Canada, it's like 1.5 million.
Yes.
10,000 is probably a generous number.
It's charitable for sure.
For that, out of that number, especially annually, when you go, okay, 1.5 million over 10 years.
Yeah. So charitable that it's only 10,000. Yes. So
every single one of those takes out 10 people. That's 100,000 of your civilians dead.
Yes.
That's a massive number. And so you don't need a bunch of people.
No, the thing is though, you talk about it being 10,000. If 10 people did it, if you had 10 coordinated terrorist attacks across any country, any civilized, I shouldn't say civilized, any Western nation, pure chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's getting guns. Everyone's staying inside. Everyone's getting racist real quick. I'm right. It's what's going to happen because they're going to have to start calling it out for what it is. You know what I mean? What do you see now? Anytime you see something, there was an attack the other day. Apparently the guy was just a drunk driver. There was an attack the other day in the UK. Guy ran through, it was a soccer, but it was a football celebration. I forget which team it was. Guys, I'm not a football fan. Anyway, it was a celebration in the UK. And there's about 1 million people there. And this guy just plowed through a ton of people. The first thing they published was, this is not being treated as terrorism. This is not a terrorist threat. Like, that goes into the headline. As soon as it comes out, they tell you exactly, like, was this terror related? Because they already know everyone's on edge. So you give me 10 national attacks in any Western nation, you watch how quick that country turns on a dime. It'll be pure chaos.
Yeah. It's wild to think about that is a possibility. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen.
For sure. No. Definitely not. But that's the look. When you, back to a football analogy, if you're an offensive coordinator, you've got, 50, maybe 100 plays that you have in your book that you can use.
That's one of them.
Yes.
There's one play that
you may not use it. You might only use it once a year. It may only come out like this odd time, maybe once in your career. Who knows? But you have the play.
Right.
That's the important thing.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Canada approved over 834,000 temporary residents in just 3 months. Canada's immigration system is spiraling under the weight of its own contradictions. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, the federal government approved over 834,000 temporary resident applications, more than 9,000 per day, pushing the total number of processed applications to 1.37 million. These include study permits, work permits, and visitor visas, mostly from countries like India, Nigeria, and China. Despite government claims that this reflects Canada's global appeal, the reality is a system overwhelmed by backlogs, growing housing shortages, and inconsistent enforcement. Ottawa now promises to cut the temporary resident share of the population to just 5% by 2026, while simultaneously deporting people already in Canada for minor permit violations. The result is an immigration regime that's not only overextended but riddled with internal contradictions. Without aligning immigration policy with infrastructure capacity, economic need, and community readiness, the federal approach risks alienating both newcomers and citizens. So, who does this system of mass immigration really benefit?
Well, I mean, for starters, it benefits the government's political agenda. That's what it's mostly about. I have a different theory about Canadian identity and sort of the inevitability of rising immigration, but that's a different conversation, perhaps. It definitely benefits a lot of the temporary residents that are seeking entry. Benefits certain industries, which is interesting, that are really benefiting from the temporary foreign workers. It's good for immigration consultants and application services. I mean, it stimulates that part of the economy. And it's good for urban real estate markets. But the problem is, those are heavily outweighed by the cons, right? So it really fails to benefit communities and infrastructure. We're struggling. Our infrastructure is breaking under the weight of what we're doing right now. It fails to benefit many newcomers. There's a statistic that I remember that always sticks with me. 6 in 10 newcomers take up to 2 years to find solid employment. Right now, we used to have a rule, and I'm sure it was flexible, but the rule was you come here, you have work, you have money. Mm-hmm. Not you come here and we try to figure it out and pay you in the meantime. And that's the new strategy is don't worry about it. We'll just pay you in the meantime. So what's the incentive? If you're making $2,000-$3,000 a month from the government and you know that it takes 6 out of 10 take 2 years to find steady work, you just bring your family over here and everybody gets a couple grand and you chill the fuck out. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? For me, this is a really bad incentive structure. And as a result, it really fails to benefit Canadian citizens as a whole. Canada is struggling to maintain social cohesion in such a massive way because of this. Healthcare is suffering, the economy is suffering, housing suffering. This is really about political optics and not really long-term integration or the long-term benefit of Canada. So to me, it's a mess.
Well, in our documentary on China, right, we discussed called The Silent Dragon, how China conquered North America without firing a single shot on YouTube. You can see that the strategy the Chinese Communist Party was employing, and our own intelligence agencies were warning about this as far back as the 90s, was what they called the unholy trinity, right? Of big business, organized crime, and then the government. And so I think this unholy trinity, this essentially like ecosystem, exists in every single nation. And so when we ask who does this system really benefit, I think it benefits all three of those prongs of the unholy trinity in different ways. So you've got the government who benefits from, now this is in regards to temporary residents, the 834,000 number, but we're also permanent residents are still going to be double historical numbers.
Yeah. A lot of what I was saying was also like immigration at large.
Right.
Yeah.
So you look at this and you go, okay, the government has been wanting to follow this whole UN plan. We talked about how they're taking their policies from these international organizations. Well, as far back as 20 years ago, the UN was releasing reports, one in specific. It's a 177-page report titled Replacement Migration. And it's all about how Western societies, their birth rate is collapsing. And therefore, we need more, essentially, taxpayers in order to pay for all of these social programs and our pension plans and all of this kind of stuff. Because if you end up with too many elderly people drawing from this and healthcare and not enough people working to supply those or to to subsidize those programs, then they fall apart. Everything falls apart, and it's just societal chaos. So from a government perspective, they looked at this purely economical. Even we saw Trudeau in 2016 say to the World Economic Forum that when he was looking at refugees, that he was seeing the future of the Canadian economy, right? So it benefits them in that they get a more loyal, even if these people come permanent residents and citizens in the future, then they get a more loyal voting base and they get a tax base to draw from theoretically. But as we see in practice, they actually end up, most of them, or shouldn't say most of them, but a large portion of them,
6 out of 10 don't find steady work for 2 years.
So actually it is most of them.
Yeah.
So they become a tax burden. But then, okay, so that's the government. And then you've got big business, which benefits from two aspects, which is increased demand for the same amount of supply. So their asset prices go up. This is where you see things like housing prices, because you've got more people competing for the same amount of goods and services.
It's basic inflation. Yeah,
and so they can inflate their prices and make, this is where you see people being like, oh, they get, like, this is one that kind of throws me, especially when they talk about the grocery stores. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure the grocery stores are gouging to a certain degree. But when they talk about, say, oh, record profits this year, it's like, yeah, but also like when you consider inflation, they're going to have record profits because everything is more expensive.
I'm not a huge fan of the grocery stores, but I look at profit margins as a percentage.
Right.
Those weren't record numbers. So it's not, that's them placing blame on someone else because they don't want to have egg on their face.
So they make more money because of increased demand. And then also even just like the asset portfolio people like Brookfield Asset Management, they see their portfolios increase because of inflation. But then also as well on big business front, it suppresses wages. So they actually, it's a double prong.
Yes.
We make more on what we sell and we have to pay our employees less. Even back in 2014, Trudeau was criticizing and the Liberal Party was criticizing Stephen Harper and the temporary foreign worker program for deflating wages.
Which exploded under Trudeau.
And then they exploded it. Yeah, it's wild. And then, okay, so that's business. And then the last people is
I actually want to highlight something before you go on. It's an important designation to make because people will go, well, no, things cost. Well, no, minimum wage keeps going up. Yes, the government mandates an increase in minimum wage. Yes, but it's not keeping up with inflation. That's the important thing. If the company owns an asset that increases in value by 10% or 20% because of inflation and wages go up 5 or 6%, yes, wages are going up, but it's still a massive net positive for the corporate side.
Mm-hmm. Well, and too, as we've seen, I really do want to dig deeper into this and try to really put the numbers together. But the government is subsidizing these temporary foreign worker programs as well, and helping subsidize the wages and such. So you go, that is also helping these businesses where even if, like, let's say they hire a Canadian for the $16 an hour minimum wage, or I hire a temporary foreign worker and a certain percentage of that $16 wage that I'm paying these people is actually subsidized by the government. So I'm getting incentivized to hire these foreign people over Canadian corn.
Yes.
And so it benefits definitely big business in that front. But then the last of that kind of trinity of aligned interests is crime. And we definitely see that where these, whether it be these terrorist organizations or whether it be drug cartels, the amount of people that just come in and completely toss their papers out, claim asylum, they wait 2 years before their asylum claim is even processed, they get their money, the government subsidizes their living for those 2 years while their claim is being processed. And these numbers are astounding. They're well over 100,000.
Yes, it's increased by 1,000%.
Wild. And so you go, okay,
from the time Trudeau got into office.
If I'm a criminal organization and I want to put my foot soldiers in there, that's an open door.
That's what I was saying. That's what I was saying earlier
They'll
about like
pay for my foot soldiers to get in.
And that's what I was saying earlier about policy and how that gets leveraged by these other organizations that are in charge of our government that are basically foreign interests in what that translates to. It's just wild.
And that's one thing I was talking to a buddy about in terms of being like, this is why I don't even really see things so much as your typical conspiracy theorist, that it's like a plan. It's aligned interests in the sense where you go, when you have three big prongs like this unholy trinity and a certain move benefits all three of them, that movement towards that thing doesn't need to be planned and coordinated because none of those three people are going to stop it.
Yes.
Like there doesn't need to be a playbook or anything. And I think there is definitely when you look at things like Agenda 2030, there's rough outlines, but it's so much more about just like it being an ecosystem more than anything, I think.
Yes. No, I mean, I agree with you. I think the only thing I would really comment there is about the immigration thing and the dropping birth rate and the reality of the fact that, yeah, like I was looking at a graph the other day. Pretty much all Western nations have a significantly declining birth rate. Like it's very low and it's a real problem. And like you said, all of these countries are built on social programs and they're too social heavy. And the unfortunate thing is when you have those kinds of programs, if your population becomes top heavy, you will crumble under your own weight. So you have no choice but to, this is the thing with Canada, our identity was going to change anyway. We didn't like, objectively, we did not let enough people in since probably World War II. If we had increased that number by 20 to 30% every year, we probably could have maintained social cohesion. And we also would have maintained the balance between our social programs and our population. But we didn't do that. Now we got to the point where it's like, it's too late. So it doesn't matter if you have a conservative government or a liberal government. They're all social program friendly. They just are. It is what it is. You can see our spending on GDP. Just look at that number. So when that's the case, it really doesn't matter whether it's a liberal government or a conservative government or anybody for that matter. They're going to continue letting over 1 million people a year into this country every year for the foreseeable future, no matter what. Otherwise, we will we will get crushed under our social programs. What are you going to do? Just stop paying them out? You have pure chaos. So Canada's identity was changing no matter what. I don't agree with the strategy they used to get there, but this Canada 2.0, this is coming. It did not matter whether this was liberal or conservative. Again, it may have looked different. It may have had a different threshold and a different set of parameters, but the volume, it was coming no matter what. And our government should have at least had the foresight to improve our infrastructure because I'm an idiot and I can identify this. So for me, that's just a bit of a letdown. Before we move on to the next topic, this episode is brought to you by the Tallow Truth. Your skin needs real nourishment, not lab experiments. That's why I use F-Bomb from the Tallow Truth, made from grass-fed, grass-finished tallow. It's also hormone-free, antibiotic-free, steroid-free, GMO-free, and even vaccine-free, because I know that's important to a lot of you. There's nothing artificial, nothing toxic. And recently, Ben and the gang at Tallow Truth dropped some new products. Their Freedom Face Whip is hands down the nicest thing I've ever put on my face, and they've also launched a new soap line made with grass-fed tallow and organic essential oils. What makes the Tallow Truth even better is that they're a freedom-first brand that supports Blendr News and everything we stand for. They even offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you've got nothing to lose. Go to the tallowtruth.com/blender and use code BLENDER for 15% off. This includes 15% off on already discounted bundles as well, so you can save as much as 40%. That's the tallowtruth.com, code BLENDR at checkout for 15% off.
Wild stuff. All right. Well, let's move on to our last topic of the day. When classrooms cross the line, a parent speaks about gender ideology in Essex County schools. A parent from the Greater Essex County District School Board has raised alarm after a 9-year-old student was exposed to classroom discussions about gender transitioning and hormone replacement therapy without prior parental consent. The controversy centers on a teacher who read the book Calvin about a child transitioning from female to male and expanded the lesson with unapproved conversations about HRT. When a Muslim student expressed discomfort, the teacher publicly shamed her, suggesting she couldn't handle these big feelings. This response sparked concerns about religious discrimination and ideological coercion in the classroom. Parents were previously told they'd be notified before health-related consent was introduced, yet these discussions occurred without oversight. Despite complaints to school officials, no changes have been made. So is this an isolated case or part of a broader trend of activist teaching in Canadian schools?
This is so frustrating. It's obviously part of a broader trend, right? You're seeing massive increase in gender identity and LGBTQ topics in curricula across the country. You're also seeing a massive increase in the people that are joining that group. It's an ever-expanding group. I can't keep up with it. But you're seeing that it's continuing to grow and grow and grow, which means where does that come from? Well, it comes from your institutions. Because there's no parents that there's no heterosexual couple. Well, there may be some, but not very many, that are like, maybe my kid's not heterosexual and I'm going to push them down this weird path. It's like, no, you get it from the institutions. Mm-hmm. So clearly this is a deeper problem. We're seeing growing reports. Like you've said, actually, you've mentioned a couple now of people that have even reached out to you to say that not only has there been a lack of consent or prior notification, we don't even know what they're teaching. This is wild. And then when they approach them about it, they're like, well, we're sticking to the curriculum, deal with it. I'd be like, where do you live? Tell you how I'm going to deal with this. I also think that we're watching education policy sort of evolve to include this progressive content in many cases without any community consultation whatsoever. It seems to me that the institutions are completely compromised and they are using the defense of the liberal government to say that they're allowed to do these things. And my concern though is it's gone so far rather, that the people in charge of these institutions, this is the way that they think. And even if you change top-down leadership, you don't change the fabric of that institution. So it's my opinion that it's completely compromised. And like you said, you see these red flags with these things, with cultural or religious values. It's just only going to continue to get worse. But it's weird because it's almost counterintuitive to what we tell people when they come here. Like, multiculturalism is our strength, except you all have to buy into this weird ideology.
Right. There is a hierarchy of beliefs.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, and that one seems to be at the top. And it's interesting because we never really dealt with this growing up. I don't know about you, but for me, I didn't. This stuff was non-existent. Didn't. So I never worried about my parents didn't worry about putting me in school. Sure, I got picked on. I picked on other people. Whatever. School is school. Otherwise, it was fine. You know what I mean? ABCs, 1, 2, 3s. A lot of stuff I'm not going to use. Pythagorean theorem, oddly enough, I have used a couple times. But otherwise, a lot of it's just nonsense. But the problem is now they're teaching you ideology that's ruining your life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because this is the generation. It's funny. It's not funny. It's sad, actually. It's kind of funny, peculiar. It's not funny, haha. This generation does have a lot of burdens to bear. They have the burden of social media and having to deal with two different psychologies. One is their real world one, and one is their one online. That's very challenging. They have the burden of the economy, which is we're handing them a total disaster. They have the burden of a useless education system and no way out of this mess. And they also have this as a major burden. This 2S LGBTQIA+. Whoa, I fucking nailed it. Apparently I haven't keeping up. This is a burden. This is a burden because this ideology, like you said, is the priority. And in my opinion, it's gone way, way too far. And kids are making life-altering decisions at a very young age, and parents are being left out. It's weird. I think that we've entered sort of this activist teaching era. And I think a lot of these teachers have been emboldened to sort of push these specific social agendas on our kids. And honestly, it may be one of the most impactful problems we have for the future of Canada because of the trajectory it's putting these kids on.
What I find interesting with this is because it's hard not to argue that the public school has always just been a function of social engineering, not actually true knowledge. In, say, if you were to go think about any of the great philosophers throughout time or anything, I don't think they would look at our public school throughout history and say these are teaching kids the proper intellectual and tools for wisdom. So you even look at how the public school was founded back in the 1830s. Horace Mann, who's thought of as the father of the public school system, he was an American, traveled to Prussia, which was old Germany, the monarchy under which used to be Germany, which is now Germany. And he saw what they was like factory style schooling system. And because Prussia was trying to turn out both factory workers and soldiers. And so it was this very like rigorous training system. Well, they brought that back to America and used it, and David Rockefeller was one of the biggest founders of the biggest funders of the public school system in America. And what he said is that, this famous quote that I want a nation of workers, not thinkers. And to entire school system was designed to act for two functions. One, to push kids to give parents essentially daycare for their kids while they worked in the factories, and also train the next generation to work in the factories.
Factory workers, right?
Now, I, as much as anybody, can take issue with this. However, this is the big difference that I see between then and now, is at least that system, which was undeniably social engineering. It was not anything I think you could classify as a real education. However, it was pushing people in a direction and giving them even behaviors and skills that they could then take into the workforce and have a life like they could work in a factory. It used to make sense.
It used to make sense. Not that it was always good, but it used to make sense.
And so when I'm not even talking about the things in the curriculum as much as even the way that school is structured. It's the breaks, the bells, the way that the desks are aligned. That's very factory. That was exactly analogous to how a factory looked in those days. Yep. And so they were training them that way. But now you go, okay, so this system that was designed to create factory workers and still does from a behavioral sense now exists in a world that there is no manufacturing. Like factory jobs are not going to go support your family today. unless you work all the time and both of you do.
Unless you own the factory.
Right. Like one parent can't go work in a factory and support the entire family anymore.
No.
But then you've also got that, but then now we've also got, so the behavioral aspect isn't there for success in today's world because we're a service-based economy now. But then also added on the kind of more software side, the ideology that they're pumping into these kids actually only further alienates them from the real world as well. Like we're literally trying to snap their psyches with this LGBTQ stuff. And actually, this is the last thing that I want to touch on here when it comes to this, when it comes to especially the queer aspect in the LGBTQ agenda, so to say. People don't really understand because it's been cloaked. It's not out there in the open. Not a lot of people know this, but like the queer theory stuff. Okay, so you've got progressivism, and progressives believe that the way that society moves forward is by oppressed groups overthrowing the oppressor class, right?
Yeah.
And now we've gotten to this new age through the critical theories that came out of the French postmodernists and stuff in the 1960s, is they broadened, it wasn't now just people, the capitalist class versus the working class. That's the domain of oppression. It's now everywhere. It's men versus women, gay versus straight, black versus white. And then when it comes to this queer stuff, they think the very concept of normal is oppressive. And so that's
wild.
So you even look at one of the most popular queer theorists, his name is David Halpern. He openly declared that, quote, queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. In other words, queer theory seeks to dismantle the very idea that anything can or should be seen as normal.
That's why they say queer is a $3 bill.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And so queer theory teaches kids to denounce our current society, all standards, rules, definitions, categories, and traditions at every conceivable level, while simultaneously announcing new queer possibilities.
$3 bills.
So literally,
I get where this is going.
So any standard in society is oppressive, and we need to tear it down. But dude, it's actually so dark. When you go look at how these queer theorists in academia, the people that are making these curriculums, I don't even think the teachers know what they're teaching. They just think they're being moral, and
I think it's more foot soldiers built in with like foot soldiers peppered with a little activism.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's the architects of these
They're
things.
the dangerous ones. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so what they suggest to liberate children from these oppressive normal structures of quote unquote normal is to give them identity crisis. So to literally break their psyche apart so that they can't conceive of normal anymore. And then now they're liberated. And so you go, yeah, no wonder you look at all these kids in school and go, they've got depression and anxiety and they don't know who they are. They don't have any aims or goals and all of this kind of stuff, because so much of this agenda that they're shoving down their throats that's the goal, is to literally put them into a crisis.
So going to school is considered normal. Okay.
I'm going to queer my child by not giving them to you.
Yes, I can take a page out of the queer book and my kid's not going to go to a normal school. That's basically how this is going to work. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is. We are where we are.
But I would even bring, like, hey, if you're a parent and you are concerned about this kind of stuff, I wouldn't even, not that I don't condone it or don't understand why you might just go in and say, don't teach my child this kind of stuff. Like, I 100% understand where that's coming from. But I would say, and there's actually a great book anybody wants to read on this called Queering of the American Child, but it's the exact same policies and agenda here, by Logan Lansing. And he breaks down this entire strategy, what queer theory and all of this really means, the tactics they use in the schools. And so just read that book, find even quotes of the people that are making this curriculum, and just ask the teacher, put the teacher on the spot. Just go, because they always try to play the moral high ground, right? And be like, oh, well, I'm just being tolerant and compassionate. Flip it on them and just go, do you think it is compassionate to purposely put kids into identity crises? Like, put them on the spot. Go, this is from the exact people that you're teaching. Do you agree with this?
I I think that that's not a bad strategy. I think getting involved at that level is a good place to start. But I truly believe that you have to pull your kids out of school and find a.
I agree.
There's a parallel education like system economy growing, and it's growing quickly, and it avoids all this stuff. And I think you just have to. I was looking at a stat the other day. The odds of your child making $100,000 a year, and this is a U.S. stat, and it was based on today. Going to traditional school was I think 10% or 10 or 13%. But if they're homeschooled, it's like 35%.
Damn.
So it's like 3 times more effective to, even if you just want them to have a positive economic future, let alone avoid all this nonsense. So I agree that if the choice you have is to get involved at that level, go do that. But if you have and I say the means, it's not even expensive, that really expensive to get your kid in like a parallel education system anymore anyway. It's like a few grand a year, $5,000 a year, because a lot of these parents are pooling together. There's a much better system out there. That I think is the unfortunate solution today.
What's crazy is I can attest to that because I've got a sibling who homeschools their kids, and I go talk to them. Actually, it was wild. Niece is about 6, I think 6, 7. And she comes up to me, and because I've got this tattoo of Myth of Sisyphus on my arm, right? And she comes up to me and goes, "Is that Sisyphus?" And like, so she starts asking, and then she's telling me all of these Greek mythological stories and breaking them down. And it's like, you don't hear this from kids. And she was very coherent in understanding all of this kind of stuff. It wasn't just like loosely understanding.
It wasn't memory, it was understanding.
She was able to go into Zeus, Aphrodite, all of this kind of stuff. And in like what the meanings of these stories are. And then you've got my nephew who can tell you everything about every dinosaur, name them, the plants that are in the backyards on things. And because my sister's got a rule, she goes, "We're learning today. Like, you have to learn something."
So it's interest-based learning.
But you tell me what you want to learn.
Interest-based learning is super effective.
You have to come back and tell me what you learned today.
Yes.
But do your thing. And then so you get these kids that are actually extremely intelligent and know what they're talking about, rather than going, "All right, this is what I'm going to shove down your throat." Like, now she hits
you hit the basics
ones,
by you back everything into STEM learning. That's what they do. Yeah, it's super effective.
Right.
Interest-based learning. Imagine, what do you want to learn about? I have people that look at videos and they go, "Oh, those Liam's guitars." They don't ask about the books. They ask about the guitars. I know your interests now.
Yeah.
This is what you want to learn about. Great. I know I can take that instrument and I can back that into a lot of STEM learning. Just that instrument. Yep. And now you're interested. And now you can apply that across the spectrum of a wide variety of things.
Yeah.
So it's just, it is the way. This is the path we need to go down. Maybe we should be thankful that they're blowing the system up.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting, especially with even AI and stuff too, well, with like parents being able to essentially create more like templates and curriculums for their own kids. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. All right, anything else you wanted to add today?
That is everything.
Don't forget to head over to our Substack where you can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 5 days a week. That's blendrnews.substack.com. We also keep all of our sources in there as well. So if there's anything that you ever want to learn more about from a episode, you can find those articles in our newsletter. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.